Do guns prevent tyranny? In this video, I'm asking whether guns prevent tyranny. There are a lot of different aspects to this. So, for example, is it really true that dictators take away guns as they gain power? Is this something that tyrannical governments do? Another aspect of this question is, could a well-armed citizenry actually defeat a dictator? So, for example, if a government was a democracy and then a dictator tried to take over, could citizens with guns actually defeat that dictator and keep dictatorship from happening in that country? Here in the United States, a lot of Americans believe this. They believed that a well-armed citizenry will defeat tyranny. In fact, 2/3 of Americans think that the purpose of the Second Amendment is to make sure that people can protect themselves from tyranny. So this question isn't just hypothetical. In the United States, it is one of the main reasons why people believe that they should be allowed to have guns. Usually my videos center around some idea that I personally become obsessed with knowing the answer to. In this case, though, it was a friend who asked me to look into this. This friend asked, is this really something that's real? Is it really true? Do guns protect us from tyranny? I'll explain first what the argument is. Then I'll talk about the research that I didn't find on this topic, research that I thought should exist, but I just cannot find anywhere. And then we'll talk about what I actually did find on this topic. Okay, first let's just look at the argument. In the United States, gun advocates often claim that the Second Amendment encourages citizens to bear arms specifically so that they can stand up against a tyrannical government. The idea is that as the United States was breaking away from a monarchy in England during the Revolutionary War, that our founding fathers wanted to make sure that the country could defend itself in case somebody else tried to become king. This is an idea that tons of people echo. Regular people say it. Think tanks claim it. There are so many websites that say this. Newspapers say it. Opinion pieces say it. There are political speeches that say that the first thing that dictators do is take away citizens' guns. As far back as 1968, the NRA said, "No dictatorship has ever been imposed on a nation of free men who have not been first required to register their privately owned weapons." The NRA claims that every dictator from Hitler to Stalin registered and/or confiscated guns. Wayne LaPierre wrote in his book, "In Germany, firearm registration helped lead to the Holocaust." The Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms in the 1990s had ads which featured Hitler, Castro, Gaddafi, and Stalin and said, "The experts have always agreed that gun control is the single best way to take freedom away from the people." Some researchers actually tracked this idea online. They did a computer analysis of 18 million words from online political discussions from Canadian and American gun enthusiasts. What they found was that Canadian gun owners were much more likely to just see guns as tools. In contrast, American gun owners see guns as a physical manifestation of political values. Guns represent individual freedom and antipathy toward government. So this idea is widespread in the United States, and it does seem to be fairly unique to the political climate of the United States. Gun owners around the world aren't necessarily going to make this argument. Gun owners in the United States definitely are. So I went into this topic trying to find research to answer the question my friend had asked. Is this really true? Do guns get taken away as governments become more tyrannical? And I expected to find the answer easily. In fact, I figured that this research had probably been done multiple times. It should be easy enough. All you'd have to do is look at one of the multiple freedom indexes that are out there that rank countries based on how free they are. How free are citizens to do what they want to do? How free is the press? How often do citizens get put in prison because they are political prisoners? How free are elections? And how fair are those elections? There are lots of different measures of how democratic a country is versus how totalitarian it is. So it'd be pretty easy for a researcher to take one of these freedom indexes, or maybe several of them, and compare that against how strict a country's gun laws are. I'm not sure if gun law indexes already exist. If they don't, a researcher would have to create a new index of gun laws. But again, that would be fairly straightforward. You could have somewhere between 5 and 10 standards that you looked at. For example, are people allowed to own pistols? Are people allowed to own shotguns? Are there rules against automatic rifles or semi-automatic or whatever, right? So you could pretty easily categorize countries according to how strict their gun laws are. Then you'd compare those two. Is it really true that if a country is stricter on gun laws, that they are also less democratic? When I went into this question, I assumed that not only this research surely has been done at least once or twice, but I assumed that probably there would be researchers who'd be arguing about exactly the best way to categorize countries' gun laws from strict to loose, and exactly which freedom index to use in order to calculate this. Instead, what I found was nothing. As far as I can tell, this research has not been done at all. What I really hoped for was a global comparison, and I really hoped that it would even be a historical comparison, for example, over the past 100 years, maybe. Instead, I found absolutely nothing. I searched and searched using every search term I could come up with. And if it exists, I am not creative enough to find the right search terms to look for this. I've looked for every variation of gun and firearm and arms and weapons and gun control, and then I've looked for every variation of that in combination with dictatorship, democracy, totalitarianism, fascism. I've used multiple search engines for academic research that I know of. I've spent hours. As far as I can tell, it doesn't exist. If somebody out there knows of research like this that exists, some kind of global comparison of countries' freedom index versus the country's gun control strictness, then please let me know. Instead, what I found was a lot of lists of countries that became dictatorships and the dictators took away guns. Even though this might sound definitive on the surface, this is not a scientific way to answer this question. When people make these lists of the countries where guns have been taken away, they're committing a logical error called sampling on the dependent variable. Let me explain what I mean by this. Suppose you looked at all the countries that became dictatorships and you found that 50% of them took away guns. That 50% number is completely meaningless unless you compare it to something else. For example, if you looked at all the countries that were democracies and you found that 50% of them also took away guns, then you'd have to say, well, democracies and dictatorships take away guns at equal rates. Or maybe if you compared these dictatorships to democracies, maybe you'd find that 50% of dictatorships took away guns, but 80% of democracies also took away guns. So maybe you'd find that democracies were more likely to take away guns. Or maybe you'd find that 20% of democracies took away guns. We don't know. Without a group of democracies to compare to, you can't actually prove anything by showing that some dictatorships take away guns. You have to have a comparison group of democracies to compare the dictatorships to in order to say that dictatorships are more likely to take away guns. As far as I can tell, this kind of global comparison does not exist. So all the lists in the world of dictatorships that have taken away guns aren't going to prove anything. I want to be completely clear here. I am not saying that dictatorships do take away guns at higher rates than democracies, or that dictatorships don't take away guns at higher rates than democracies. What I'm saying is nobody knows. Anybody who just gives you a big list of dictatorships that took away guns is either lying to you, trying to make a point that isn't really there, or they're confused and they don't understand how social science works, which I think is probably more likely. So that's the disappointing news. I didn't find the research that I was hoping I would find that would actually clear this question up. Now let's talk about what I actually did find. First, I found papers by historians who are disagreeing specifically about Hitler. Among gun advocates, they really like to say that Hitler took away citizens' guns. Realistically, gun advocates could point to any dictatorship, but because Hitler is well known, at least in the United States, as being the poster child of evil in a lot of people's minds, gun advocates tend to use Hitler as their example of someone who takes away guns. For example, there's a quote from Hitler that is used very often in gun advocate circles, in which he's praising gun control. He says, "This year will go down in history. For the first time, a civilized nation has full gun registration. Our streets will be safer, our police more efficient, and the world will follow our lead into the future." While this quote is definitely chilling, the unfortunate thing for gun advocates is that historians say that Hitler never actually said this. There is no evidence at all that this is a real Hitler quote. There is no historical authentication. There is nobody who knew Hitler who wrote in their diaries saying that he said this at any point. There are no newspapers from that era that print a speech where he said this. There is no historical authentication at all. The quote is a fraud. Not only is this quote an urban legend just because there's no historical authentication for it, but it's most often dated that Hitler said it in 1935, but in 1935, there was no Nazi law or registration associated with guns. When most historians are describing how Hitler seized power, gun control either isn't part of the discussion at all, or it's an extremely minor part of the discussion. Most historians say that Hitler's rise to power happened because Germany felt humiliated after World War I. He was a brilliant propagandist and orator, and because Germany's economy had tanked. You'd be very hard-pressed to find a real historian who would say that gun control was a major part of the picture of how Hitler seized power. Hitler's SA did battle, like literal street battles, with other groups and won control, but most historians say that was because most of his SA was World War I veterans who had been taught how to fight and taught how to conduct themselves in battle, not because of gun control. Now let's look at another aspect of this narrative that historians disagree with. Historians generally disagree with the idea that Hitler enacted gun control at all. What I read over and over is that Nazi gun laws were a lot more complicated than gun advocates today pretend that they were. From 1919 to 1920, Germany passed laws banning guns entirely after World War I in order to comply with the Treaty of Versailles, and this was long before Hitler was in power. So keep in mind, before Hitler came to power, guns were completely banned in Germany. And even before the treaty, Germany had pretty strict gun laws. In April 12, 1928, Germany relaxed gun laws, but a lot of historians argue that the gun laws were relaxed specifically to enable Hitler. So this isn't a picture of a dictator coming to power by making gun laws stricter. This is a picture of a dictator coming to power by making gun laws more relaxed. Although I do want to point out that most historians would say that Hitler's rise to power had nothing at all to do with gun laws. In 1938, the Nazis engaged strict gun control laws and regulations that required licensing and reporting for acquisition, transfer, or the carrying of handguns, and for dealing and manufacturing in firearms and ammunition. A lot of people today will look at that law and say, oh my gosh, it's so strict. Hitler must have been controlling guns. But they forget that the backdrop was a country that didn't allow guns at all. So this law is showing that Hitler was actually more pro-gun than the government before him. There was a 1938 law that said that Jews, specifically in Nazi Germany, were banned from owning guns. The historian I read said that this was not unique to Jews, that Hitler tried to make sure that his political opponents didn't have guns. So the overall picture is of Hitler as a dictator coming to power and actually being more pro-gun than the government before him, although that still isn't very pro-gun by modern US standards. You could use Hitler as an example of a dictator that tries to take guns away from the people that he's planning on persecuting later. He definitely did that, so you could make that argument, but you could also make the argument that Hitler as a dictator was more pro-gun than the people before him. So Hitler's actual historical record on guns is not as cut and dry as gun advocates try to make it seem. I found a whole other body of research literature where historians were questioning whether citizens with guns can actually stand up to tyranny. Is it reasonable to expect that a citizen militia could fight against a military that was backing up a dictator? If a dictator tried to rise to power in the United States, we would hope that the military wouldn't back that person, that the military would say, no, 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 we want democracy and we're not going to back a dictatorship. If that happened, then the dictator would have no power and wouldn't be able to rise to power. The military would stop them. If a dictator rose to power in the United States, it would have to be because they had military backing. Otherwise, they can't rise to power. So the question is, could citizens that are armed be able to fight against a military that was backing a dictatorship? What I found from historians was a resounding no. Civilians have absolutely no chance against a trained military. During the Revolutionary War, that was one of the times in history where the weaponry on either side, civilians and military, was basically the same. And even in that situation, civilian militias were disastrous. There's a romantic but historically inaccurate idea that civilians won the war against the British in the Revolutionary War. George Washington clearly stated otherwise. George Washington recognized that civilian militias were being completely destroyed by trained British troops who had exactly the same weapons. And George Washington specifically said that he needed a trained military to be able to defeat the British. And the historical record backs that up. Civilian militias almost always lost terribly against the British military. Historians say that that pattern is even more true in the modern era when militaries are going to have much better equipment than civilians are going to have. Even when civilians hugely outnumber the military wins. Modern war is just too sophisticated for anybody except for highly trained experts to master. For the past 100 years, the US military has been specializing in weapons that allow a very small number of soldiers to go up against a much larger force and still win. So at this point, especially if we're talking about the US military, even a tiny handful of soldiers would be devastating to the civilian population. There are also romantic notions from World War II that civilians were able to be successful against the militaries that were fighting. However, the historical record shows that that isn't true. Civilians were really good at spying, providing information and intelligence, and also sabotage. But when civilians actually tried to fight against professional armies on either side, their effectiveness ranged from slight to disastrous. For example, in Warsaw, Poland in 1944, 1 million civilians rebelled against Nazi tyranny, and they were completely crushed by the German army, despite the fact that that army had been drained and exhausted after 5 years of war. In that conflict, for every 1 German soldier killed, 20 Polish civilians were killed. So yes, even 1 million civilians cannot go up against a trained army. Some Second Amendment enthusiasts cite the 1989 Afghanistan withdrawal of the Russians, but what they forget is that the people in Afghanistan were being beaten, and pretty badly, until the US military stepped in and provided Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to the rebels. Afghanistan did not win because of citizens that had guts and heart and bravery and a few guns. Vietnam is also cited by Second Amendment enthusiasts because people wrongly, incorrectly believe that the US military was beaten by pajama-clad Vietnamese citizens who had nothing except for guns and a lot of heart behind them. Vietnam was won by a well-organized, well-trained military with 22 divisions, tanks, missiles, and heavy artillery. When the US did go up against Vietnamese civilians, for example, during the Tet Offensive of 1968, the US military won. The French didn't lose Vietnam against armed civilians either. The French lost in a dramatic siege that involved heavy artillery, cannons, mortars, and rocket launchers. These aren't just civilians with guns. Even in the very few cases of supposed success where civilians were able to beat a military, in all those cases, they were cases where the civilians were able to capture military equipment, learn how to use it, and turn it around against them. Guns are just not effective against modern military equipment. Even when the military is awful, which obviously the US military is not. The US military is one of the strongest militaries in the world. But even when you can find examples of a really awful, badly equipped, badly trained, losing money military, like the Russian military in 1995 against the Chechens, the Russian military still won. The Irish Republican Army, which is kind of misnamed because it was mostly civilians, went up against the British military for 25 years and eventually gave up in 1994 because they lost. They did not destroy the British Army and only succeeded in making many of their own people hate them. David Koresh followers in Waco were extremely well armed compared to most citizens, but they were devastated by law enforcement, and the law enforcement they went up against was very lightly armed and trained in comparison to the military. So even in a case of a very well-armed citizenry and a very lightly armed military, if you consider the law enforcement a military in that case in Waco, Texas, even in that case, the law enforcement won. Some pro-gun people claim that a well-armed citizenry will deter attacks from a military, but there's no evidence of this either. Most of these gun enthusiasts will point to Switzerland. They say that in every Swiss home there are guns, and Hitler knew this, and he refused to attack Switzerland because of how well-armed the citizenry is. The problem with this idea is that there is no historical record of this being true. What we do have historical record of is Hitler sneering at Switzerland and talking about how easy it would be to overtake. There is no evidence at all that Hitler or his people were afraid of Switzerland. The way Switzerland avoided being overtaken by Hitler was that the Swiss stayed on Hitler's good side by manufacturing arms for Germany so that they wouldn't be attacked. So, overall, historians believe that an armed citizenry cannot defeat a military. The idea that we're going to arm enough citizens that they're going to be able to stop tyranny, stop a dictator, that's just not true. Now, I do want to add some caveats here. Just because historians are skeptical that civilians can defeat armies doesn't mean that there is no relationship between gun control and tyranny. A dictator may not actually know that the armed citizenry is most likely to fail. A lot of dictators aren't very well informed on a whole range of issues. So a dictator may not actually know that armed citizen groups aren't good at defeating militaries. A dictator may still take away guns on the mistaken assumption that that will keep the dictator safe. Another caveat I want to put in here is that even though historians feel very sure that an armed citizenry cannot defeat a dictatorship, that doesn't mean that that wasn't the original intention of the Second Amendment. After all, the founding fathers who wrote the Constitution didn't have a great grasp on history at the time. They didn't know nearly as much about history as we do today, and they certainly didn't have historians and social scientists breaking down this information. So it is still possible that the Second Amendment was written intending to protect citizens from tyranny, even if the way that it's written isn't actually going to protect citizens from tyranny. That may have been the original intention. Let's summarize. Are dictators more likely to take away guns than democracies are? Nobody knows. If anybody tells you that they know for sure that this relationship is a solid one, the relationship between dictatorship and gun control, they either don't know what they're talking about, which I think is more likely, or they're lying to you. The real scientific research that would prove the answer to this question one way or the other just hasn't been done as far as I can tell. This kind of scientific research would have to show a global and preferably even a historical comparison between a country's freedom and the amount of gun control they have. As far as I can tell, that kind of research has never been done. And historians are very skeptical that an armed citizenry can actually defeat the military of a tyrant. But, like we talked about, that doesn't prove that the Second Amendment wasn't written with this in mind. And it also doesn't prove that dictators might not take away guns, because dictators may not know this fact.